Jason. I saw a name. Okay. Okay, that's great. Okay, thank you. Okay,
Okay.
now we're gonna have to, we're gonna have Jason
Okay.
as, thank you, Jason. Yeah, right now we're gonna have Dr. Jason. Dr. Jason, I do not know how to pronounce your last name. How do you pronounce your last name? Borges?
Borges.
Oh, Borges. Okay, thank you. Yeah, we are so delightful and so we are so thankful because Dr. Jason Borges is willing to bless us today with his research. Yeah, I'm I met Jason maybe around like 2 years ago, right? Yeah, 2 years ago in Turkey, and I'm so thankful
Yeah.
because he spent a lot of time for us and with us, and he opened our mind about New Testament. Because like for me, especially like I'm as Indonesian, I was studying in the States, but I never knew about the context, the background, about the archaeology. But once again, we are so thankful. Just Jason helped us to understand, and we are so thankful because Jason will share with us about his research. Before we begin our presentation, I gonna read his resume for all of us. May- Maybe maybe somebody can share his resume here. Okay. Yeah, maybe After presentation, I think I will give you a few minutes, Dr. Jason, to introduce about about your research and also about archaeology in Turkey. So because like
Okay.
here, most of us are pastors and also like seminary professors, and we will be so thankful and delightful if we can get an opportunity to go to Turkey as well. Yeah, this is Dr. Jason Borges. He is yes, I think he is a co-founder of Asian Minor Research Center in Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah, he received his PhD in 2023 from Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. His dissertation title is Travel Among Early Christians, a socio-theological analysis of Pauline and Ignatian communities. I believe this dissertation already published by Brill. I already check it out. It will be published in Brill August 25th this year. So all of us, if you want to learn about his dissertation, we can buy on Brill. And then he received his MDiv in 2008 with intercultural studies at Talbot School of Theology. Also, he received his BA, Bachelor of Art, in 2001 from Biola University, and he really spent I don't know, maybe you spent like a few months or maybe like a few years at Jerusalem University College, and his academic position right now he is an associate director for Asian Minor Research Center in Turkey. His roles includes public scholarships, historical research, conference presentation, and guide training. He is also an adjunct at Columbia International University, Columbia, South Carolina. Okay, next. And this is like his two books. Yeah. The first one is his dissertation that is published by Brill this year, and also his second book will be published next year. The title is, yeah. And also, yeah, the title of his second book is, please go back a little bit, Christian Life in the Greco-Roman City. Next. He has published his articles at Journal of Early Christian History, Tyndale Bulletins, Journal of Biblical Literature, BTB, Biblical Theological Bulletin, and Scottish Journal of Theology. Next. Thank you. Once again, we appreciate our gratitude and also our gratefulness for your time to equip us, to enlighten us, and then to be blessing for us. Once again, thank you, Dr. Jason. The time is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, thank you for your very kind introduction and your invitation to participate in this. The organization has been very excellently planned and managed. I want to thank Shania as well, as she has communicated with me and really helped me out prepare for this. And so I thank you for both your time and for your ministry of teaching and pastoring and serving in Indonesia and many other countries. And so it is, your work is close to my heart. Although I grew up in America, I have lived most of my life in Muslim countries, trying to serve and equip and grow the church. And so Indonesia was actually the place when I was a young person out of college. I felt like God was leading me to Indonesia, but it did not work out. Here I am 25 years later in Turkey, and thankful for how God has led us, but do have a special place for Indonesia and for many of you, although we have not met in person. So yeah, I met Philip 2 years ago on a biblical field studies trip. Let me go ahead. I want to share my screen here. Let me do this. I will share all of that. Allow. Okay, is my screen is being shared in full, yeah? You see my title slide? Okay, great. So yeah, I met Philip 2 years ago, and the occasion was that I organize what's called Biblical Field Studies trip here in Turkey. And this is a funded study trip for scholars and teachers from the majority world. And you can see Philip is the tall guy there on the far right. I'm the short guy in the middle. And also in the picture is Kenneth, who I see is on the call as well. So hello, Kenneth. I'm glad you joined in here. And I mention this because some of you might be interested in this in the future. Every year, we do this trip, and we like to have 10 to 12 scholars and professors from around the world, from the majority world specifically. So we pay for your entire time in Turkey. You just need to pay for your time or pay for your trip to and from Turkey. So if you are interested in that, you can check out my website, biblicalturkey.org, for that. So I am thankful for this chance to present on this topic, the Agora in the book of Acts, a Topos, or a place of judgment and vindication. This is actually my first time presenting this material, some of my research. So I would be more than thankful for any feedback or comments, critical suggestions that you might have for improving this paper. So I will go ahead and begin and read through it. And I believe I have about 1 hour to present, and then some time for question and answer. So the Book of Acts is a setting-rich narrative with events in many locations. In addition to geographical places, narratives in Acts occur in various human-built civic venues, like temples, synagogues, houses, and prisons. The narrative and characters of Acts move through various regions, cities, and urban structures. The resulting spatial imagery contributes to the author's theological motifs, such as universalization and Gentile inclusion. The multiplicity of locations in Acts reflects the author's spatial consciousness, which is the awareness of perceptions, experiences, and symbols associated with real-world spatial phenomena. Although the prominence of space in the Book of Acts has been notably explored, most scholarship on the interaction between theology and spatiality focuses on geographical places or events in Acts 1 through 12. This article examines a civic venue that appears prominently in Acts 16 through 18, namely the Agora. Despite being a central feature of Greco-Roman cities and the setting of 4 scenes in the Book of Acts, the Agora Topos in the Book of Acts has been largely neglected. This paper seeks to interpret how the Agora setting in 4 agonistic settings contributes to Acts' theological distinctives. After a brief orientation to the critical theory of narrative space, this paper examines the history and archaeology of Greek agorae and Latin forums, concluding that the civic spaces were largely judicial venues for public evaluation and judgment. This reassessment of the Agora enables new readings of Agora-based stories in Acts 16 through 18, in which divine vindication from human prosecution destabilizes the presumed authority of Roman magistrates. Thus, the Agora setting actively contributes to the theological purposes of Acts, which involves the reproduction of a new civic yet heavenly space throughout the Roman Empire, created through the ascended Christ, who vindicates his people from public prosecution. So first, I'll talk about narrative space and settings. Charles Dickens' book Bleak House opens with the vivid description of its setting in London. Implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had been entirely retired from the face of the earth. With invading smoke and inescapable fog, the bleak scene sets the tone for the novel's themes of legal corruption and moral decay. The physical setting conveys social realities.
Dr. Jason?
Yeah.
Apologies. Maybe can you maximize your PowerPoint?
Oh, because you see the next slide as well.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Is that better?
Yes. Wonderful.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Philip. Good. Given the embodied nature of human existence, space has a long-standing role in narratives. Nevertheless, settings have been interpreted as merely backdrops for events and characters. In literary analysis, space is a relatively neglected dimension of narrative, especially when compared to time. The foregrounding of time has come at the expense of space and place. This is particularly true regarding interpretations of the Book of Acts, which generally prioritize the apostolic actions and events over places and spaces, and hence we call it the Acts of the Apostles, or the actions. In recent decades, however, literary theorists have recognized how settings are active elements within a narrative. Physical locations within a story contribute to its meaning. Places can interact with and shape characters, thus influencing the narrative's development. From this perspective, setting involves not only the physical space, but also the conceptual and symbolic dimensions of space within the narrative. Stories both use and construct space to produce meaning. Juan Olivia's concept of narrative environment incorporates social, historical, and environmental factors that shapes how spaces function within a narrative. Authors access the experiences and imaginations of their readers to create story worlds. So, space in stories is better understood as dynamic environments constructed in response to readers' actual lived experiences. They're not just passive static backdrops. The framework of narrative space primes us to consider the lived experiences and implicit meanings associated with Greco-Roman agorae, which Acts could presume of its model readers and thus utilize to construct its narrative theology by reconfiguring the Agora. Developments about narrative space are part of the broader turn among the social scientists. Philosophers and geographers have examined the social production of space and how it intertwines with power and identity. Embodied engagement with the physical and space influences our view of that space and shapes how we perceive and engage the space. This paper utilizes Edward Soja's third space model to interpret the Agora setting in the Book of Acts. First space refers to the physical, visible world. This includes material landscapes and built structures. Second space refers to the mental or imagined space shaped by culture and society. Third space, which is even more abstract, represents the dynamic hybrid space of experience, where the physical and imagined spaces intersect. In this realm, people can test and interpret their space, making it a site of possibility and resistance. Third space creates alternative territories that explore a new worldview and reinterpret reality. Soja's three types of space enable new readings of the Agora scenes in Acts 16 through 18. In brief, the narratives of public encounters in the physical town squares of ancient cities, that's first space, that were associated with civic judgment and Roman rule, that's the second space meaning, contributes to the development of Christians' new worldview regarding Christ's rule through the ascended Christ, which is the third space. So I will examine Agora and Fora, the function of Agora and Fora as a public scene of evaluation in Greco-Roman cities. Then I will analyze the Agora-based scenes in Acts 16 through 18, and then the final section presents how the Agora functions as a place of divine vindication and heavenly rule in the book of Acts. So let's talk about the Agora as spaces of justice in the Greco-Roman world. Here's a picture of an Agora from the nearby city for me of Perge. The Agora was a centrally located open plaza where people could gather. Basically, what you see here on the picture on the right is the open area where the dirt was. The gravel area in between the columns would have actually been a colonnade, that is, would have been covered with the roof. And to the left of the picture and at the far end of the aisle were different shops. So you have a central open area surrounded by a colonnaded portico or a covered sidewalk. And then outside of that are shops. And that essentially is what the Agora consisted of. The root verb agero meant assemble or gather together. New Testament translations and lexicons related to early Christian studies glossed the term agora as marketplace. This suggests that agora were commercial centers to buy and sell goods, the ancient equivalent of a shopping center or bazaar. In this regard, the Louw-Nida Greek-English lexicon is illustrative. Under the semantic domain, earn, gain, or do business, it defines agora as a commercial center with a number of places of doing business, market, marketplace, business center. The gloss marketplace is certainly valid, as commerce did occur in the agora. However, a broader analysis of agorae, along with Roman forums, suggests that trade was not the only or even primary function of ancient town squares. This section examines linguistic, archaeological, and literary data from the classical and imperial Roman era to understand the civic function of agorae. So I mentioned that English translations often translate the term agora as market or marketplace. I'd be curious how Indonesian translations or other languages translate the term agora in the New Testament. Classical dictionaries foreground the political aspects of the agora. The Oxford Classical Dictionary, for example, defines agora as an area where people gather together, most particularly for the political functions of the polis, which is the city. The term agora originally referred to the gathering and assembly of people, especially for debate. Eventually, the term designated the urban space where the citizen body that constituted the Greek polis assembled to govern, and hence it became the seat of government. Because of the legal proceedings conducted in the agora, the Greek term agora and its derivatives often referred to a place of judicial assembly. In Greek-speaking provinces, the assize, or the traveling courts, was designated as agoradikon, agoras, or e agorea. The judicial meaning of agora dates back to the classical period, which would be like 4th, 5th century BC, when it meant assembly, and continues among Greek authors into the imperial era. The Latin term forum also referred to the courts held in the open public square. The locus of the Roman law is the forum, which not by chance soon became a synonym for judicial activity. References to forums indicated both general legal activity and special locations of courts within the broader forum. The customary practice of Greek magistrates adjudicating law in Greek agora and Roman fora formed a sociolinguistic connection between the architectural form and judicial practices. Thus, the terms agora and forum both became synonymous with judicial activity. And just to clarify, the Greek term is agora, the Latin term is forum, and they both refer to the same thing, a central town square. The political judicial function problematizes conceptions of the agora as commercial marketplaces, thus opening new possibilities for interpretations within New Testament studies. In the classical era, the agora took its defining and influential shape. The agora was foremost a space of the polis, or the local community, to deliberate and decide matters of state. It was the seat of government. This political and judicial function from classical Athens in the 4th, 5th century BC continued well into the imperial era in the 1st century. The Athenian agora, as the paradigmatic agora of ancient Greece and model for subsequent Mediterranean cities throughout the Roman Empire, played an outsized role in defining the ancient agora. After its destruction in the year 480 BCE, the Athenian agora was reconstructed to support the primary civic institutions for governance. I won't go over the full archaeological map of the agora. I'll just describe it here briefly. This is the agora as it stood in the 2nd century CE during the Roman Empire and a little after the time that Paul went there. It is color-coded. The purple structures were built in classical era, 5th and 4th century BC. The yellow structures were built in the Hellenistic era, which is essentially Alexander the Great to Caesar Augustus, the 3rd to the 1st century BC. And then the red was built during the Roman era, which is essentially from the time of Christ on forward. So you can see the Roman agora was used and was built over a very long period of time. And it has a central square area, which the Romans actually built several structures in, but then around it you have courtyards and other buildings. By the year 400, the principal buildings for housing all aspects of the Athenian government, that is legislature, administration, the judiciary branch, and the military, were all accommodated in the agora area. The agora's architectural form reflected the ideals of Greek philosophers who conceived of the agora as the city's administrative and judicial center. When Plato outlined the composition of the ideal polis, he said residences for officials on law courts should be situated around the agora for the administration of justice. Aristotle held a rather dogmatic position. He resented how the commerce of vendors tarnished government functions. He claimed that the ideal agora was, quote, one which has to be kept clear of all merchandise and into which no artisan or farmer or any other such person may intrude unless summoned by the magistrates. In sum, the classical Athenian agora was designed to accommodate political governance. The space allowed the citizen body to adjudicate and administer matters of the state. Although the idealized Athenian agora emerged in the classical era well before the Book of Acts, it bears upon the meaning of the Roman era agora, such as is referenced in the Book of Acts. The paradigmatic town square of Athens helps establish the political judicial context of agora and fora in the imperial era. So let's talk about agora and fora in the Roman era. So just to clarify, in Latin, the singular is forum. And so in English, we would sometimes say forums by adding an S, but in Latin, the plural is actually fora. So if I say fora, it just means forums, the plural of the term. In the Roman era, the town square was the central civic space for the exercise of government and justice. Writing in the 1st century, The architect Vitruvius identified fora as the most important civic space, quote, where matters both public and private are governed by the magistrates. In Roman cityscapes, the forum was the heart of the city in an administrative sense, of course, as a place where the institutions of government were clustered, as well as in a legal sense, as a place where public business, including law cases, was conducted. This was particularly true in the imperial capital of Rome, where public squares maintained strong connections with judicial activities. On normal business days in Rome, the fora would be crowded with judges, advocates, and litigants from the city of Rome, Italy, and beyond. The most commonly referenced court of Rome was that of the urban praetor on the east end of the Republican Forum, which has been imaginatively reconstructed in this picture. As law cases increased, Caesar Augustus built another forum to hold the trials. The literary and archaeological evidence suggests that the main courts of Rome were transferred to the new forum of Augustus early in his reign. Roman emperors themselves often dispensed justice in the forums. Dio Chrysostom states that Claudius, for example, dispensed justice from the tribunal most often in the forum, but sometimes elsewhere, end quote. The forum was the primary venue for the practice of Roman law and justice. Beginning in the Hellenistic period, from the year 300 BC and on, and then accelerating in the Roman era, Agora in eastern provinces became increasingly politicized. Romans erected honorific monuments in the plazas and enclosed the space like a peristyle courtyard. This architecturally transformed the town squares of cities into stages designed to demonstrate and occasionally redefine the power of the civic elite. As the monumentalized seat of government during the imperial era, Agora projected Rome's imperium or power in distant communities. The Agora, quote, continued to be the center of politics and administration in most, if not all, Greek polis. In this public space, Romans governed by holding court and dispensing justice throughout Roman cities. Romans developed the conventus system to administer justice in the provinces outside of Rome. Rather than law being a permanent aspect of local communities, as in the city of Rome, the Roman governor of provinces such as Pamphylia, Asia, or Cappadocia traveled around at intervals to the judicial districts in the province to hold court. The appearance of the governor and his entourage became occasions of great pomp and circumstance, akin to religious festivals. The performative dispensing of justice before large crowds was a central manifestation of Rome's imperial rule over the local Greek populations. For this reason, Roman courts were customarily held in the Agora. Plutarch describes the common scene. Do you see the vast and promiscuous crowd which jostles and surges in confusion here and about the tribunal and the Agora? They bring lawsuits and litigation at certain stated times, and the overwhelming multitude of people, like streams flowing together, has inundated this one Agora. The occasional nature of the Roman conventus judicial system required a large public space for judicial events. One thing that's really interesting to me is that the Romans, even though they had great architectural and legal achievements, actually never constructed dedicated courtrooms. In Roman jurisprudence, justice was administered wherever the magistrate was presiding. His symbolic insignia and his lictors defined any space as a court. An indispensable element of Roman courts was the tribunal, which was a raised platform upon which the judges sat while presiding in order to visualize their imperial power. Political theater required the tribunal to be in public view, which best occurred in the Agora. Public spaces such as theaters, baths, and gymnasiums also are attested as venues for trials. However, the public trials were customarily held in the Agora. Courts were organized in various parts of the Agora. A natural venue for tribunal courts was Bemata, the plural of Bema, which was a multi-purpose platform in the courtyard of Greek Agora. The permanent stone structures were raised several meters and had columns supporting a roof. When a bema was not available in an agora, a mobile wooden platform was erected, most often in the basilica. This distinctively Roman building type was an elongated covered hall that framed one side of the agora courtyard. At the far end of the basilica was a colonnaded at the far end of the basilica was a semicircular recess, which was the site of judicial business. This site made the basilica the most prominent judicial space in Roman era agora and fora. In some cases, the seat of judgment in the basilica was directly over prison cells, which reinforced the Romans' prerogative to render judgment. And this becomes important in the book of Acts because they go into the agora, and then they are sent to prison, and that prison was likely an underground space below the basilica or the site of judgment. The tribunal platform could also be situated in the agora's open courtyard. On a coin, which I have here, that commemorates the Emperor Caracol's visit to Laodicea in the year 216 CE, you can see the emperor is standing on a stepped platform where he presides as judge at the far end of the agora's stylized courtyard. The scene illustrates how Roman emperors and their provincial representatives held court in the agora. Thus, in the agora, areas such as the bema platform, the basilica hall, and the open portico served as venues for Roman tribunals. A common feature of Greco-Roman judicial spaces was their openness and publicity. The administration of justice was public in the very basic sense of the term. The open setting of agoras and forums enabled the public to attend the courts as onlookers and even participate by responding to judicial processes. And this is actually a very common event in Greek novels. The accessibility and openness of the courts made the agora, at its core, a public stage for negotiating and managing social identities. This function characterizes events in the agora beyond the formal evaluations conducted through the courts. The civic agora was also a space where mobs practiced vigilante justice, because lower-class idlers often filled the public space. Demagogues easily stirred the restless riffraff into a mob to contest power structures and advance their interest. For example, when a certain Scipio wanted to secure the censorship of Macedonia, he rushed into the forum, which is, or into the agora, attended by men who were of low birth and had lately been slaves, but who were frequenters of the forum. Sorry, I have the quote here. Who were frequenters of the forum agora and able to gather a mob and force all issues by solicitations and by shouting. Crowds gathered in the agora to assert and determine social status, as we shall see in the book of Acts. Even apart from judicial events such as official courts and mobs, people utilized the agora to negotiate social status by peacocking through the agora with fancy clothes on, erecting honorific statues in the courtyard, and even when they bartered for goods in a competitive fashion. In ancient societies that prized honor and social recognition, the notoriously public and populated town squares offered a constant court of reputation. In the agora where people gathered, status was projected and witnessed, contested and defended, claimed and lost, enhanced and diminished. The agora was purposefully and decidedly a public square where people, through various activities, claimed status and issued social judgments. In short, it was a court of reputation. Although it risks being anachronistic and trivializing matters of state, a modern comparison illustrates my point about the primary social function of the agora. Defining and translating agora as marketplace is like calling the mall in Washington, D.C., which is the name of that whole area that you see there on your left, the Central Park and the buildings around it, or Parliament Square in London, which is pictured on the right. So you'll both notice these are open areas surrounded by buildings. So translating agora as a marketplace is like calling the mall or Parliament Square a shopping center, because there on the sidewalk, there are certain people who sell souvenirs to the tourist. Yes, commerce does occur in the Washington, D.C. Mall and London's Parliament Square, but in design and function, they are foremost political and legislative places, the seat of government. Because ancient people commonly experienced and conceived of the Agora as a venue of social evaluation and judgment, ancient narratives, like the Book of Acts, could access and transpose those common associations of the Agora by situating scenes in the public space. The setting offered a dynamic environment by which authors could construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct social identities linked with political authority in the Agora. This fact allows for fresh reading of Acts narrative set in the Agora. So let's go ahead and look at the Agora scenes in Acts 16 through 18, actually. When Paul visits the Greek cities of Philippi, Thessaloniki, Athens, and Corinth, he and fellow Christians are tried before Roman officials and crowds in the Agora. In each case, they obtain a favorable outcome. This section analyzes the judicial scenes, noting how each narrative destabilizes the authority of local magistrates and reformulates the Agora into a heavenly courtroom in which God's people experience his vindication. So the Agora in Philippi. In the city of Philippi, turbulence began after Paul silenced the spirit of divinization in an enslaved girl. When her owners considered the financial implications, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the Agora before the rulers. They publicly charged the itinerants before the Roman officials. The magistrates are identified here as strategoi, which is the pair of leading magistrates in Roman colonies that presided over the courts and administered justice. In cities without a Roman council, these strategoi were the ruling magistrates. Their authority was visibly expressed and enacted through what's called the fasces, which is the bundle of wooden rods that magistrates carried or their attending officials carried for them. As instruments of executions and floggings, these fasces sticks were used to beat Paul and Silas. They represented the magistrate's supreme authority. In this first occurrence of the Agora in Acts, the civic space functions as a site for public judgment. When the mobs seek prosecution, they bring Paul and Silas from the place of prayer to the Agora, where they expected Roman officials to hear their case. Their accusation reinforces the legal and imperial associations of the space. As the location for judicial procedures, the Agora was the locus of Rome's imperial rule. The setting allows idlers in the Agora to join the attack against Paul and Silas. To appease the vigilante mob and ensure public order, the Roman officials used their discretionary authorities to detain the accused, even without a proper investigation or trial. The actions of public violence and incarceration performs the magistrate's negative evaluation of Paul. This punishment, being placed in an inner prison and then fastened with stocks or chains, ascribes a marginalized status. The imprisonment does not represent a scene change, but a continuation in the Agora under the jurisdiction of Roman officials, because as I had mentioned, the prisons were often lower spaces in the Agora. After the public condemnation of Paul and Silas, the narrative shifts towards a divine reevaluation of the prisoners, or their vindication. By praying and singing to God, the prisoners destabilize. Their audience of prisoners listening to them serves as a positive counterpart to the violent Agora mobs. A sudden earthquake, which biblical and Greek authors use for theophanies, that is, appearances of God, signals God's intervention on their behalf. The opening of prison doors and the unbinding of the chains overturns the magistrate's directives, suggesting a higher authority presiding in the Agora courts. In contrast to the slave owners who prosecuted Paul and Silas, the jailer's family receives Paul and his message. The magistrates apologize to and release Paul and Silas. This completes the narrative's evaluation. God's messengers are freed from prison to gather with believers and continue proclaiming their message. Those dragged into the Agora for prosecution receive a favorable disposition. With public judgment followed by divine vindication, the initial Agora scene of Acts 16, 19 through 40 in Philippi becomes programmatic for subsequent narratives. The Agora in Thessaloniki. And by the way, the pictures I am showing are actually modern contemporary pictures of the historical remains in those cities. So interestingly enough, for all four cities, Philippi, Thessaloniki, Athens, and Corinth, you can go and visit the Agora or the Forum as it would have existed in the first century. Or I should say, where it was located in the first century. Obviously, a lot of the surrounding buildings have fallen down. After Philippi, Paul and Silas proceed to Thessalonica, where they preach in the synagogue. A positive response prompts some Jews to respond publicly. Elements of the narrative infer that the scene occurs in the Agora, even though it's not explicitly mentioned. The zealous Jews first gather some wicked men of the Agora. The phrase ton agorain most literally refers to objects and people who are in or of the Agora. The word was sometimes used in an innocent sense, like it is in trader, but it tended to refer to the lower kind of people in the marketplaces, so is often translated as rabble or mob. Negative overtones in the word agores do not decouple the adjective from its space-focused meaning. For such people, as agitators for hire or disgruntled day laborers, were labeled according to their conduct in the Agora. The crowds depart to the house of Jason to bring Paul and Silas before the Demos. This civic assembly of citizens in the free city of Thessalonica had the judicial authority to adjudicate the charges against Paul and Silas. Since the citizen body of Greek cities typically met in the Agora, the narrative assumption is that the angry mobs were bringing the defendants back to the Agora for public trial before the Demos. Since Paul and Silas had already departed from Thessalonica in the story, the mobs, who are unwilling to return empty-handed, instead bring Jason and some other Christians before the city authorities, which Luke identifies as the Politarches. This group comprised of 3 to 7 senior civic magistrates with the political authority to maintain order in the city. The position of Politarchus was instituted by the Romans to ensure civic peace, yet the members were annually elected by the local population, and so they were answerable to them. With this civic responsibility of administering the local council and administering Roman rule, the Politarchus maintained a public profile working in the Agora. In the case against Jason, the Politarchs appeared swayed by the informal jury of the mobs in what is depicted as a public trial in the Agora. The narrative outcome suggests Paul and other Christians are innocent. Jason does provide security to ensure his guest good behavior, but such a light punishment does not match the crime of treason. The Politarchs perhaps regarded the charges as fabricated, yet, like the magistrates in Philippi, they felt compelled to take some measure in order to appease the agitated mob of the city. Likewise, Paul and Silas exit the city without any accusation. Similar to Philippi, though without a supernatural theophany, the outcome implies divine favor in the form of escape from public accusations. In the enigmatic phrase, decrees of Caesar, it appears as though this refers not to the instructions for imperial worship, but actually imperial letters that granted the city of Thessaloniki free status in the empire, which meant judicial freedom. In this case, the crowd's accusation against the Christians creates irony in the judicial narrative. The people of Thessaloniki appear worried about forfeiting their status as a free city, which included judicial independence. The Thessalonians' unsuccessful attempt to protect that right to judge by exercising that very right to judge against people who they accused as proclaiming a different imperial authority questions the basis of that very right. Who possesses the ultimate authority to issue people the right to judge and evaluate others? With various levels of public evaluation that conclude with the release of God's messengers, the Agora scene in Thessalonica undermines the authority behind Caesar's grant of judicial autonomy to Thessalonica. Let's go to the third scene, which is set in Athens, as pictured here. In Athens, which was the intellectual center of the Greek world, Paul reasons daily in the synagogue and in the Agora. Of these two gathering spaces associated with Jewish and Greek communities, the narrative proceeds to recount only Paul's engagement with Greeks in the Agora. The general description of Paul's ministry as occurring in the Agora every day with those who chance to be there establishes the setting for subsequent events beginning in verse 18. The Athenian Agora was recognized from classical times into the Roman era as a central location for teachers to discuss and debate ideas. So it was a natural venue for the proclamation and evaluation of Paul's message. Several audience members who consider Paul's teaching as strange in verses 18 and 20 take him before the Areopagus to adjudicate the matter. Now, I mispronounced it. Areopagus was actually a short nickname for the full legal council. And the full name of the council is the Council of Ares Hill, or E Boule Ex Areopagos. So Areopagus refers to the heel of Ares, which was the Greek god of justice, upon which the council actually met. But Areopagus does not refer to the location in the sense, but the actual council or the judges. It emerged during the Attic period, so the 6th, 7th century BC, as Athens' highest court, and it remained the city's supreme judicial authority into the Roman era. It was the effective government of Roman Athens and its chief court. The term Areopagus could mean, depending on the context, either the judicial council that served as the highest court in Athens, or the physical location upon which it traditionally met. By the 1st century CE, the court convened sometimes at the hill that it was named after, which was to the south of the Agora, but more often it met in the Agora at the Royal Stoa, which was a colonnade along the northern edge of the Agora. I'll go back to the picture and show you. So the Royal Stoa would actually be right here in the picture on the left side of it within the Agora. And the Areopagus is up here on the far right of the picture. You can see that hill there. So you can see it's a bit more removed away from the Agora. The actual Agora would have ended about right here. This was the southernmost Stoa. So this space behind it was outside of the Agora, and the hill there was as well. But again, Areopagus here in the book of Acts refers not to the location, but to the council that used to meet at that location. The text of Acts does not specify where the court convened, but several narrative details suggest it met in a stoa within the Agora. Paul's trial proceeds immediately from accusation in the Agora without any delay for the court to assemble, which suggested as the events of the trial happen nearby. The crowd of spectators on Paul's location in their midst suggests the speech occurred in a public area. Paul's defense echoes the famous trial of Socrates, which occurred in the Royal Stoa. And the trial narrative of Paul's Athenian court case mirrors the trials in previous Greek cities that occur in the Agora. Thus, Paul's defense before Athens' highest officials appears to have been set in the Agora. The author does not portray formal legal proceedings against Paul with a stated verdict, yet the event is more than just a response to Athenian curiosity. In several ways, the story presents Paul as being on trial in the sense of being publicly evaluated by local authorities. I give several reasons. One, Paul's audience seizes him in verse 19, which means to take hold of and bring before political authorities for a trial in other occurrences of that word, epilumbanomai. Two, the leading officials who comprised the Areopagus met as a court, so they would not come together just to meet for curiosity. Three, the fact that some replied positively and that Paul was not apprehended for further investigations implies some deliberation and acquittal. Fourth, though, and most striking, is evidence for an implied trial scene there in Athens is noted by parallels between Paul's experience and the trial of Socrates. The clear similarities in both defendants' actions and speeches cast Paul as an accused defendant in a public hearing. Those scholars approach Paul's speech as an intellectual and philosophical discourse. The narrative material surrounding the narratives from other Greek cities in Acts invites a more political judicial reading of the event. The similarities between Paul and Socrates also draw into relief their peculiar differences in a manner that advances Acts' theological interest. Whereas Socrates employed philosophical reason to suggest that the Greeks could not know the gods, Paul emphasizes that God has revealed himself through Christ's resurrection, verse 31. So people no longer live in ignorance because God has appointed Christ to judge the world. Thus, Paul's defense speech to the highest court of Athens climaxes with the assertion that the person whom God appointed, ironically, that very person, Jesus, was vindicated from human execution. That person whom God appointed sits in judgment over all people. God's past vindication of Christ confirms Christ's future judgment of the world. And that reality overshadows the Areopagus' role in evaluating Paul. The revered Athenian courts that famously tried Socrates lacked the prerogative to pronounce judgment upon Paul, God's true messenger who identifies with the divinely appointed righteous judge of all. In the Athenian court where Socrates was convicted and executed, Paul gains adherence and freedom. The outcome of Paul's case before the Areopagus applies Christ's status as the ultimate judge into the present. By virtue of the resurrection, which Paul proclaims to Athens' esteemed judges, God has appointed a new judge who now acts to vindicate his people from accusations in the Agora. So here is the Agora in Corinth, and that is actually the bema that is mentioned in the story there in Acts chapter 18. The archaeological remains of it were found in 1930, and so that's the lower part of it, and it would have had a covering and a roof there. So the bema was on the edge of the Roman Forum, which is here in the foreground, the open area there. So for the sake of time, I am actually going to skip over my analysis of Acts 18, 12 through 17, the Agora scene in Corinth. But I'm sure by this point you can see the common motif and you can read that story and see the common elements of judgment and then vindication in that story as well. And of course, you can reach out to me by email to receive a full copy of my paper if you are curious about that. But now I will go towards my conclusions. The Agora Topos in Acts. The four narratives about Paul's ministry in Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, and Corinth follow a structured pattern, which Tannehill identified as a public accusation type scene. Narrative tension builds with a public accusation and judicial response to Paul's ministry. Angry slave owners in Philippi accuse Paul of unlawful customs before the strategoi. Envious Jews in Thessalonica denounce Paul's host for subverting Rome before the Politarchus. Concerning Athenians, bring Paul before the Areopagus, and Jews in Corinth charge Paul of unlawfulness before the proconsul. Each narrative reaches its resolution as the accusations fail. Whether through an earthquake in Philippi, furtive escape from Thessalonica, release in Athens, or dismissal in Corinth, God's messengers are cleared of charges and continue ministering. The book of Acts repeatedly narrates the course of events so that Christians, here in the mold or imitation of Jesus, are found innocent by the Romans of seditious criminal activity. In terms of Roman jurisprudence, they are dikaios, innocent, or just before the law. The positive outcome of the public accusation type scenes in Acts represents the vindication of God's messengers and, by extension, their message about Christ. The four trial narratives of Acts 16 through 18 occur in the public space of ancient Mediterranean cities in which Roman elites expressed their rule through the practice of justice. Precisely because the Agora was a setting for government rule and public evaluation, it offers a dynamic context for Acts to develop its theology regarding Christians' alternative conceptions of status and authority. The Agora contributes to narrative meanings as a symbolic venue through which Acts establishes the ascended Christ's protection and vindication of his people. In Soja's framework, the Agora as a physical space, that is first space, that was widely associated with Greco-Roman justice, becomes a domain of divine vindication for Christians. That is to say, conflicts in the Agora produce other worlds that imagine new meanings for shaping spatial practices, such as the experience of divine justice. Or to use Foucault's concept of heterotopia, the Agora scenes in Acts disrupt conventional spatial orders and practice an alternative mode of sociality, which for Christians was centered upon God's evaluative judgments. In the Agora, Paul and other Christians were not making tents, trading goods, or engaging culture. Rather, they were experiencing the reality of God's righteous judgment in face of human accusations. The Agora space contributes to characterization in Acts. In the four scenes, the text of Acts consistently and correctly uses titles for local judicial authorities: strategoi in Philippi, Politarchus in Thessaloniki, Areopagus in Athens, and Antipatos in Corinth. The references to Rome-appointed authorities governing in their civic domains establishes the physical and social scene of each narrative. The Agora represented the magistrate's right to rule, akin to the phrase, "as the king sat upon the throne." This setting prefigures the narrative conflict regarding judicial authority. The repeated vindications infer that 1. Rome-appointed magistrates were not the highest authority presiding in the courts, and 2. The Agora now functions as part of the domain of Christ's heavenly authority. In the Agora scenes, unruly mobs and Roman-appointed officials appear as the bicameral court that issues and enforces social judgments. But the repeated dispositions in Paul's favor imply a higher authority. They imply an authority that is higher than the civic judicial system. The narrative yields a judicial crisis with competing claims of control. This is like in a modern story when it talks about, a rival to the king or to the president going and taking the royal palace and sitting upon the throne or sitting upon the president's chair. The Agora, as with all shared space, constructs and encodes authority, which Acts leverages to develop its theology. The Agora Topos advances Acts theology regarding Christ's authority over prevailing regimes. The motif contributes to what Sleeman identifies as, quote, the key theological change in geographical horizon within Acts, which is namely heavenly Christocentrism. In the book of Acts, the heavenly Christ is, though hidden from sight and yet sovereign and transformative within earthly spaces, continues to order and challenge earthly spaces within the narrative after his ascension. The vindication of God's people decenters Greco-Roman judicial authorities. Instead, the ascended Christ presides over earthly courts in the Agora from his tribunal in heaven. The involvement of divine beings in judicial matters was a common assumption in antiquity. Filled with important temples and sanctuaries, agoras were religious spaces. The gods' physical proximity to the judicial spaces inferred an ideological connection. Judicial decisions reflected divine justice. The gods' presence validated legal decisions. The intense sacredness of the agora reinforced the claim that Roman rule, expressed through their practice of justice, was the will of the gods. Thus, the implicit yet real claim of Acts regarding Christ's activity in the agora on behalf of his favored people aligned with ancient conceptions of civic justice. However, Acts recounts events in the agora so as to make Jesus, rather than Zeus or Jupiter, the divine being who oversees justice. Later Christian literature, especially martyr narratives from the 2nd and 3rd century, include repeated narratives of judgment and vindication set in public agoras. They adopt the public accusation type scene of Acts 16 through 18, though with one notable adaptation. Like Stephen's martyrdom in Acts 7, the vindication of Christian martyrs tried in the agora occurs not through acquittal and freedom, but through the defendant's testimony and heavenly welcome. Despite the appearance of defeat in their death, the martyr's witness, which usually occurred during the agora trial in the agora, receives vindication when God welcomes the imitator of Christ into his presence. Thus, martyr narratives portray agoras as heavenly courtrooms in which God overrules human judgments, even executions. The recurring type scenes in early Christian martyr narratives as early interpretations and appropriations of Acts 16 through 18 further develop and utilize the agora as a topos of judgment and vindication. The agora-based trials in early Christian literature, beginning with Acts, served a broader rhetorical function. The large audience creates a public scene that not only enhances narrative intrigue, but also summons us as the readers into the evaluative process. On a metatextual level, the presence of an internal audience invites readers to imagine themselves as fellow spectators, if not also as judges rendering verdict on the justice of the story as a whole. The public evaluations in Acts, with Jews, agora crowds, and civic leaders gathering in the agora to try the Christians, summons readers into the evaluative process. As fellow spectators with a broader heavenly perspective, we are expected to evaluate the accused Christians and their message. Thus, we are brought into the agora, a topos of Roman rule and judgment, to witness God's vindication of his people. Having considered how the agora space contributes to narrative events and characterization in Acts 16 through 18, here I briefly mention 3 implications of this reading upon the broader interpretation of Acts. 1, the agora-based trial narratives in Acts 16 through 18 extend the public accusation type scene established earlier in Acts. Chapters 3 through 7 include multiple trial scenes set within the Jerusalem temple complex, the space in which Jewish leaders held court. The Jerusalem temple functions as the original topos of human evaluation and divine vindication in Acts. Once the narrative moves beyond Jerusalem to Greek cities, the agora functions as the setting for trials against Christians. God's people obtain favorable disposition before both Jewish and Greco-Roman authorities, and this happens in their respective judicial locations, the temple and the agora. Such events confirm Christ's jurisdiction over those judicial spaces and the apostles' association with Jesus, who himself was accused by humans, yet divinely vindicated by God. The ideologically driven scenes and confirm the extension of Christ's authority over earthly magistrates, assuring readers that the innocent will be saved from accusations. So the second implication, the clustering of Agora scenes in Acts 16 through 18 advances the spatialized theology of Acts. It's interesting to me that all four Agora scenes happen consecutively, right here in Acts and not elsewhere or in any other chapters. Why is that? After the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, which allows for Gentile participation in the people of God, the narrative of Acts features Paul going to leading Greek cities as the fulfillment of that event. Narratives based in the Agora, which was the quintessential Greek civic space, confirms the gospel's advance among Greek peoples. The Agora setting in Acts 16 through 18, more than a static backdrop for Paul's proclamation, represents the fulfillment of God's plan to welcome Gentiles. The message and people of Christ have now moved beyond Jewish space, that is, beyond Jerusalem and the temple, to distinctively Greek spaces, cities of Greece and the Agora. 3. The spatial reading of Acts as a topos of evaluation and vindication has implications for our understanding of Acts' audience and purpose. Some interpreters have suggested that Acts was an apology to positively influence the perspective of Roman officials regarding Christians as innocent. In that view, the primary audience of Acts was the people of Rome, and its theology was conciliatory. That is, Christ's earliest followers did not seek to become the new Rome by means of a direct assault upon its public policy, and so Rome should not be involved in the controversies within the Jewish community involving Christians. However, the interpretation of the Agora as a political judicial space suggests that the narratives of Acts 16 through 18 foreground God's overriding authority, not the favorable verdicts of the Roman magistrates. Thus, the book of Acts is not an apologia of just the Christian movement, but the power of God at work in human lives. Acts asserts God's presence in and control over the Agora, a space symbolizing dominion and jurisprudence. The narratives demote the judicial authority of Roman magistrates, thus making Acts a subversive and unbecoming text for such an audience. In contrast, the theological message of Agora scenes in Acts 16 through 18 appears directed to Christians. In this case, the book of Acts stands in the broad stream of early Christian literature that sought to encourage Christians who are facing public judgment with the promise of divine vindication. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jason, for your presentation. Okay.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah. And yeah, we have his email if you want to ask more about his presentation or maybe about Asia Minor Research Center, you can ask him. Okay, now we're gonna open questions. And the first question we have from Amran, please. Amran.
Thank you, Dr. Felicia. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for chairing this discussion. And thank you, Dr. Jason, for the topic. And this is also very interesting. My question is that to what extent that Agora was recognized by Roman authorities during the time? And then second question, you mentioned that in your conclusion, Christians represent Agora as vindication. So how did early Christian reconcile this, I mean, their theological expression, while they also experience persecution or discrimination during the time? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Amran. Those are good questions. So your first one is a little bit more historical, and I think the question is, if the Agora is a feature of Greek cities, of ancient Greek cities, come the first century, how much did Romans recognize the Agora courts? And the answer to that question is that the Romans were the Agora courts. The Romans, as they came in and took over these Greek cities and expanded their imperial rule throughout the Mediterranean, the primary way that they did that is by having either the Roman governors themselves or Roman appointed local leaders rule from the Agora and exercise that rule in the Agora. So for example, in Acts 18, which we did not read, it reads about Galileo, who is the Roman proconsul. That is, he was essentially the governor of the province of Achaia, who came from Rome to rule there, and he rules from the Bema, or the tribunal platform in the Agora. Whereas in the previous 3 cities, it was more Roman-appointed local magistrates. So hopefully that answers your question. The second one, yeah, I emphasize how this Agora is a site of divine vindication, but obviously Christians were not always publicly vindicated. They did continue to suffer. And that is where, for example, there's the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Does not say where that happened, though. But then the question, this occurs a lot more in the martyrdom stories. So in the 2nd and 3rd century, we have a good collection, maybe about 10 to 12 stories about early Christian martyrs. And these events against them typically happen in the Agora. And of course, they were not vindicated in the sense of receiving a release or, from the courts, but they're actually, convicted as guilty and killed. The vindication comes in the sense of welcome by God through the resurrection. So Christians know that through that they are actually vindicated through the resurrection and by given eternal life with God. So they follow like Jesus. And we have to remember that Jesus himself was vindicated in this way. And so Jesus himself was not vindicated in the courts in the sense of, Pontius Pilate did not release him and let him go, but actually convicted him and executed him, but yet he was vindicated. So the vindication for Christians can happen in 2 ways. It can happen in an earthly judicial sense of being released. That's what we see in Acts 16 through 18, or it can happen in a more spiritual way through, resurrection and eternal life that we see elsewhere. But it's interesting in Acts 16 through 18, it is all the present one. And I think the point of that is to establish the Agora as a part of the heavenly court of Jesus.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. And then, yeah, we have the next question. We have the next question in the chat box. It says that, so the first question is, Jews, why the Jews are jealous and why would they bring them to Agora? And the second question is, what is the perspective we can take as today's Christian in this topic while facing injustice like this, and how is it still relevant to our daily life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first question, why are they jealous? It's a bit difficult because the text does not say. The inference is that Paul's ministry is successful, and so certain people are leaving the synagogue in order to follow Paul's teaching. They did not see that as becoming a different religion or them like leaving Judaism, but becoming a different, a different type of Jew. Or they were upset that Paul was, sometimes we call it sheep stealing. taking people from one synagogue or kind of one community to another Jewish community. It's also interesting to note that it's not always the Jews who bring the accusation to Roman authorities. Sometimes it is, in Philippi, it was the slave owners who would have been Gentiles. And in Athens, it was his audience that would have been Gentiles too. So twice it was Jews, twice it was Gentiles. What can we take that? How can we take this when facing injustice? This is a question I would love to hear from you, because I know that as Christians in Indonesia, you are a minority within your country, and it can be unfavorable towards you, and you can face injustice. I don't face that as much as you do. I think one thing that we can take is the reassurance that even when we are going through different court cases, it can be terrifying. We feel like we don't have control. We are at the mercy of these secular courts and these judges who may not like us. In reality, there is actually another Supreme Court that rules over them, that their decisions are being influenced by Christ, who sits upon his throne and has ultimate authority over it. So recognizing that their decision is not final, no matter what it is. Even if we go to prison, even if we are face death, their decision is not final. Ultimately, the decision of Christ is final upon our life.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jason. And we have another question from Ph.D. Please, Ph.D.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jason. Thank you for bringing the new perspective based on the acts of the meaning of the Agora. Because if we search on the lexical dictionary, most of them define the Agora as a marketplace, like BDAG, Freeberg, Ridderstad. And if we search in the Gospel in the New Testament, Agora appear in the Gospel and in the Acts, book of Acts. Neither else in the other letter. It seems that you make a difference between the meaning of the Agora in the Gospel and in the Acts, because in the Gospel, Agora means a marketplace, and in the book of Acts, you bring a new perspective of the Agora. How do you think about that?
Yes. So this is a very good question. I'm glad you brought this up, and I'm still thinking through this. So in the book of Acts, Jesus tells parables. For example, an owner wanted to find some workers, so he goes to the Agora to find some workers, or he's mentioning how the Jews buy certain cups or certain food in the Agora and they bring it home and wash it. Certainly, the Agora, commerce did happen in the Agora. It did function in that way. But that was not the primary meaning of the Agora. So lots of things happen in the Agora. Religious festivals occurred in the Agora. Trade and commerce happen in the Agora. The judicial courts happen in the Agora. So it was a multi-purpose space. But what I am trying to establish is that when we look at the Greek and Roman authors, and when we look at the primary meaning and understanding that they gave it, they saw it as a political and judicial space. It was a place for rule and judgment. Yes, on the sides or in the open courtyard, there were people buying and selling. There were shops around it. But when we get to the book of Acts, that's not why the scenes are set in the Agora. It's not because Paul is working there and making tents and trading them. The book of Acts does not talk about that. And so the book of Acts has judicial scenes in the Agora. And so my question is, why are these consistently in the Agora? But yes, when we get to the Gospels, the mentions of the Agora in the Gospels are more incidental. They're just kind of part of a parable or something. I don't think they carry as much meaning or as much theological intent as in the book of Acts. I think it's just more incidental. And you are right, the only mentions are here in Acts and in the the Gospels. There are none in the epistles. However, there is the verb that you may know, agorizomai, which means to buy, to sell, to redeem, as well. And that is actually quite, that becomes separate. There's not a judicial meaning of that. But Paul uses that verb quite a bit for redemption, how we are redeemed in Christ. So I'll just plant that seed without further explanation.
Thank you, Dr. Jason.
Yeah.
Thank you, Teddy. Do you have any more questions, Teddy?
Yeah, but you mean that still there is two meaning of the Agora. So buying transaction in the marketplace, and then in the book of Acts is a judicial court.
Yeah, so both of those are interpretations of agora. So I prefer just to use the Greek term agora. I think English speakers are somewhat familiar with it. If you wanted to have some translation, I would pick something that is more neutral, and I usually use town square. Town square just refers to the physical place. What happens there and why it gets used is subject to interpretation. So marketplace or courts are interpretations of how the marketplace or how the town square is used. So I actually think English translations should use agora, just transliterate the Greek term, or town square, but they should not use marketplace or courts. However, in Acts chapter 19, that when Paul is in the theater, and he's being accused, and the Roman official comes in and tells all the people who are chanting "Great is Artemis" to the Ephesians, he says, "The agora are open, go take your case to the agora." And most English translations at that point actually translate it as courts. So it'll, in Acts 19, I forget the verse, it says the courts are open in most English translations. And I think that's an interpretation. I think it should just mean the agora are open. I think it's a correct interpretation, but it's still an interpretation. So,
Okay, thank you, Dr.
Thank
Jason.
you, Dr. Jason.
yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Teddy.
Okay, maybe, yeah, for our audience, maybe can you explain a little bit about the relationship between Agora and also Basilica or something like that? Maybe,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I wish I had a good picture of it. Actually, let me go to a scene here. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, is the picture showing in full there?
Yes.
So this whole scene is the Agora. What you have here is the central plaza. And then you have this a statue of the emperor here. You have a temple on the far side as well. And then around it, you have different porticos or stoas. These are open, covered spaces for people to gather. On one side, such as this one, this here would have been a basilica. Basilica, it was a Roman architectural building, which is a long hall like this, a long open hall on one side of the Agora courtyard. And essentially, basilica comes from basilus. It just means the king's hall, where the king or the ruler presided. At one end of the basilica on the inside, there would have been a rounded area where the king would have sat and would have held court from there. So the term basilica does not, as far as I think, does not occur in the New Testament, but it's a very common architectural feature, and they're very common in the first century. The Roman emperors like to build them as a part of to show their patronage towards these Greek cities. They would commission and build basilica halls along the along the agoras.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jason. And we have another question from Andreas Setiawan. Maybe Andreas Setiawan, can you present your questions to Dr. Jason? Okay. 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 Andres Setiawan asks like this: What theological message is presented by God by allowing these apostles to be misunderstood, slandered, and killed in Agora before vindicating them?
Well, that is a much broader theological question. Why does God allow suffering and evil for his people? I do not have an easy answer for that.
In Agora.
I'm a new in the Agora. Yeah, well, just in general. Yeah, why does this happen in the Agora? I think the point is to illustrate the vindication that follows it. Yes, Christians are obviously accused. That's a much broader point within Acts. You know, the apostolic kerygma or preaching is consistently, you killed Jesus, but God rose him from the dead. And so as you may have noted, stories in the book of Acts about the apostles in Acts parallel the stories of Jesus. So what the apostles experience mirrors what Jesus experienced in the Gospel of Luke. So Jesus himself, again, was vindicated by God after human judgment, and therefore it happens again. And I think it's just to, clarify who has ultimate judicial authority and who declares Christians to be righteous and just and innocent. So the question is, does this reflect a cruciform model of divine mission? Yes, I think it does indicate how God does work through suffering to accomplish his purposes. But of course, that does not mean that we seek suffering or that there is no other, model or instances of, Christian ministry or divine mission. So yeah, within Acts, obviously God uses suffering and persecution of his people in order for his message to go out. I think within the Agora scene, though, again, theologically, it relates to the supremacy of Christ, who has ascended in Acts chapter 1 and still rules over people. And then 2, it's connected to the fact that the Agora is a distinctly Greek space. And so here we have, as the gospel goes forth into Gentile territories, it goes forth not just into the regions of the Greeks or the cities of the Greeks, but into the very heart and the civic structures that characterize Hellenistic communities or Greek communities. So I think it shows kind of the universal mission as well, or the universality of God's mission.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jason. Now we have question from Dr. Jendring, please.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Borges.
Thank you.
My question is regarding the understanding of Agora in the Septuagint. The translation of Agora in the Septuagint is used in, I just read it actually, here on the translation of the Septuagint from this Kohelet text. Like Kohelet 12 verse 4, it says, "Wasaguru de la bashuk." The translation in the Septuagint is using Agora, ke klisusin thiras en Agora. So, and the door is shut. But interestingly, the translation of this shuk, which could be translated as a street that has also markets, but it's not really the same with Agora. The using of the word bashuk in Proverbs 7:8 is not translated with Agora anymore in the Greek Septuagint, rather with theodis or theodois, the way through. So there is a different understanding of the idea of agora in the Septuagint, which is the translation of or the interpretation of the Jewish society with Hellenistic point of view. So my question is, do you think that this type of agora could exist in Jerusalem in the time of in the New Testament time, for example, or probably in the Hellenistic time of Judea?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, a very insightful question here. I have not looked into the Septuagint kind of background of it, so I'm glad you raised this question. I can offer a few initial thoughts. One, obviously, the 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 Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible was written within a Jewish context that did not have Agora. So you have Hellenistic Jews trying to translate a text from a community that did not have Agora. So I don't expect the Hebrew Bible to have any explicit references to the Agora in any way. It just wasn't part of the civic architecture of Judean cities. Come the first century, yes, it was. There were many gymnasiums. So we know that Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC tried to Hellenize the city of Jerusalem. One way that he did that was by building a gymnasium, which is also another distinctively Greek civic structure. He did this also by converting the temple into a pagan temple. And although it does not mention it in the Maccabees, although an agora is not mentioned in the Maccabees, as far as I know, I would think that by the 1st century there would have been an agora in Jerusalem. It's much harder to know for sure because doing archaeological excavations in Jerusalem is very difficult, and the vast majority of the city has been built over. And then it got destroyed. The city got destroyed by Hadrian in 170. In 130. So anything pre-130 CE would be very difficult to reconstruct. But yes, I would presume that the city of Jerusalem did have an agora in the 1st century.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another questions? Okay, I think we don't have any more questions and our time is up. Dr. Jason, once again, thank you for your availability. Thank you for your research and thank you for your willingness to bless us, to bless Indonesian people. And I know at least 2 people from our group, Kenneth and also Getachew, present as well.
Getachew.
Yeah,
Hey,
Getachew.
Getachew.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Well, hopefully
Yeah.
I can meet more of you. If you come to Turkey, please let me know. And hopefully some of you can apply for the Biblical Field Studies trip. Or, Lord willing, I come to Indonesia one day.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
I will talk to Dr. Gendry so you can visit us in Indonesia, hopefully in
great.
the near future. And also 2 of my friends are going to Turkey this June with you, Budianto Lim and also Lydia, both of them
Yes.
from Indonesia. And I introduced them to Biblical Turkey, and then they told me,
Great.
yeah, they are so grateful because of this
Yeah.
opportunity. And I told them,
Yeah.
say hi to Jason from me.
I've only emailed with them, but I look forward to meeting them. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And then we're gonna have a certificate of appreciation. Yes. This is yeah, and we're gonna send you to your we're gonna send the certificate to your email as well. Once again, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Jason.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
yeah, thank you for your time, and we are so grateful. And now, yeah, you can take rest. Thank you.
Okay. See you
Okay,
later.
and
Bye.
then bye. And